And those good types of fats, like a hierarchy of different fats, rather than extreme fat loading, would reduce the risk. And in the insulin secretion, that collapse happened because beta cells barely saw glucose or even protein for months. So with fatty acids and ketones as that primary fuel source with nothing else, there was no glycemic challenge. There was no reason to produce insulin. So the system adapted by deprioritizing any kind of carbohydrate handling. And this was totally reversible. It wasn't permanent beta cell death. So if you're doing keto, here's what we need to change. Here's what we need to make sure we are doing to not run into these issues. First, make sure your keto diet is adequate in protein. Okay? This mouse diet was 10% protein, which is stupidly low. Okay? Humans should aim for, I would say, at least 30% protein on a ketogenic diet. Okay? To preserve your lean mass and support the metabolic function, at least 30%. And unless you are doing like a strict carnivore for a specific reason, I wouldn't go zero carb. Like 20 to 50 grams per day from some fibers and things like that. That's going to prevent that extreme lipid overflow just by slowing things down a little bit. So like even non-starchy vegetables. Okay? Consider like some psyllium. Consider a little bit of like chia. Okay, it's good for your gut health and lipid metabolism anyway. And then third, the fat quality matters. There's a balance of saturated fats alongside monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats that is really good and much better than just extreme saturated fat loading. I'm all for saturated fat, but we do need to look at fats as a whole system. Okay, so think olive oil, avocados, nuts, fatty fish, along with butter and coconut oil. And then fourth, I've never been a fan of saying strict keto forever. Use it cyclically, even if it's a year and then a few months off. Okay? Years without a break, that can be stressful. That is stressful. So periodic carb refeeds with healthy fruit, healthy carbs, cycling between keto and low to moderate carb, or targeted carbs around training, all this will prevent that beta cell adaptation that you see in this like long-term ridiculous keto. You also need to monitor your response. So track your lipids, track your liver enzymes, track your fasting glucose, track how you feel. It's all good. Like if you see triglycerides climbing and you see your liver enzymes rising, or your glucose tolerance worsening, these are signals that you need to maybe reintroduce carbs surrounding your workouts or something like that. The main point is that you need to use keto to restore metabolic flexibility, not replace it. We are not we become a one-trick pony rat. This mouse study showed that impaired glucose tolerance happened because the animals lost their ability to handle carbs. But human studies generally show the opposite because we have improvements in insulin sensitivity, we have reduced reliance on medication, and in some cases, even full remission of type 2 diabetes. In fact, there was a study in nutrition metabolism that compared a low-carb keto diet to a low-glycemic mixed diet in grown-ups, talking to kids, with type 2 diabetes for 24 weeks. So the keto group in this case aimed for 20 grams of carbs per day with no calorie restriction, while the low glycemic index group followed 500 calorie deficit and low GI carbs. In this case, the keto group actually saw a 1.5% drop in their HbA1c. And I think it would be wise to pump the brakes on. The machinery itself was damaged, so we were unable to actually let the insulin packages leak. The machinery itself ended up broken, so progressively worse. In fact, it got worse in the high-fat diet group. Remind you that high-fat diet group is high-fat and you're still moderate carb. The conclusion that the researchers drew was that the longer you stay on this version of keto, the worse your glucose tolerance gets. Now, we have seen in other studies that can be reversed in a short time, but it was still interesting because they found that the keto mice actually remained insulin sensitive. So that's a twist, right? The problem wasn't actually the insulin resistance. It was actually insulin secretion. So in insulin tolerance tests, the keto mice responded normally to insulin, but when they were given glucose, their insulin levels barely rose, which kind of sounds good until you realize you need insulin, right? So in the high-fat diet group, there was hyperinsulinemia. In the low-fat groups, we saw pretty normal insulin release, and in the keto group, there was almost no insulin increase after glucose. You can see that that's problematic, nothing to bring the glucose down. So they even did what's called a hyperglycemic clamp test, and they found that insulin levels didn't rise until around 90 minutes after eating, so massively delayed. And what this reflects is essentially a total collapse in the first phase of insulin secretion. So if we dig deeper with this, they looked at what are called beta cells, and they isolated these beta cells. using cells that are in the pancreas to secrete insulin. They confirmed that keto islet cells secrete around 1/3 the insulin of low-fat diet islet cells. So the insulin secretion machinery itself ended up broken. So they went deeper to understand why and what's happening here. And they used what's called RNA sequencing. And with this, they found an increase in endoplasmic reticulum stress, which just means that cells can't properly fold and process proteins, which is critical for just repair, right? And using something that's called electron microscopy, they also saw structural damage to the Golgi apparatus. And essentially what that is like our beta cells produce insulin, and they have like a production line when they produce insulin. So the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi are like these factories that process and package insulin to get ready to leave the warehouse. So the keto diet was breaking down that production line at a very cellular level, and the machinery itself was damaged. So we were unable to actually let the insulin packages leave the warehouse. The keto diet was literally impairing insulin secretion by breaking down the endoplasmic reticulum and just the whole traffic system, the assembly line there. The good news is, and this is the part that like people that are anti-keto aren't really talking about, is that this is reversible, and it was reversible. Okay, when long-term keto mice were switched to a low-fat diet for 4 weeks, glucose tolerance returned to normal and insulin secretion recovered. So it doesn't mean that keto is bad, it means that you're having a severe adaptation, and the type of keto you do really matters. So it suggests that the beta cell defect is not permanent, it's an adaptive state that can be reversed when the diet environment changes, right? So let's talk about what this means for us humans, okay? Because we have to switch things up a little bit. But I don't think people are doing this high level of fat, but we should adopt some things. So if we look at it, this was a very extreme version of keto, right? Almost 90% fat, 0.1% carbs, and 10% protein, eating as much as you want for the metabolic equivalent of years. That's nothing like a typical human keto diet. Imagine just basically eating coconut oil for 3 years. I mean, really, that's kind of what this is like. That's not exactly practical. So we're going to get into the specifics. Like I want to share like the things that you could do, things that you did, and it's really important. So we're going to, in just a minute, we're going to talk about how you change up your keto diet, what it might want to look like now in 2026 based on some of this evidence, right? I also put a link down below for a company called Thrive Market if you want to try getting some healthier keto protein options. Thrive Market is an online membership-based grocery store. Makes it super simple. They're a sponsor on this channel. They have been for years. But it also applies directly to what we're talking about here because you can log into Thrive and you can sort by keto and you can sort by like all different kinds of things. You sort by gluten-free, you can sort by this, and they don't have like garbage nutrients coming in. They vet all of their products. So they turn away thousands of different products, including thousands of keto products that have garbage in them. Preservatives, yes, that exists. So if you're looking for like good meat sticks or good jerky or good sardines, like Thrive has these, even for people that don't have access to higher quality food because maybe they're living somewhere that's hard to get it. That is a 30% off discount link for your entire first grocery order and a free $60 gift. So it's a good time to just, hey, I'm gonna jump on it, I wanna give this stuff a shot, I wanna load up my grocery cart and get 30% off. So that link is down below, it's in the top line of the description. We need to understand mice stuff. These breed of mice that they were using, they're specifically used as an obesity and diabetes model because they are more genetically prone to diet-induced obesity. They're also more prone to liver fat, and they're also more prone to, hey, guess what? Beta cell stress. So specifically under high fat conditions. So they have a very different metabolic rate. They have different feeding patterns and different like pancreatic resilience compared to humans. It's wildly different. Then thirdly, 36 to 44 weeks in mice, like we talked about, that's years in humans. So most humans use keto for months or maybe for a year or two, but they'll take breaks or they'll at least have adequate protein. Not for what amounts to multiple years without a break with very little protein. Unless you're maybe someone that is epileptic and has to be on keto to not have seizures. And then it's a trade-off that maybe you're willing to take to be like super high fat, but even then, not this high fat. And also the ad-limited nature of these diets that we're going to study don't isolate the effects of the diet itself. Humans tend to use keto with energy restriction. In fact, if you look at the studies, most people on keto are still in a deficit because the appetite goes down. You're not unlimited eating. But despite these limitations, the study still teaches us that we should really use keto correctly so that we don't run into these issues, even in the short term, because that lipid traffic jam happens because of near zero insulin combined with massive fat intake, and protein produces insulin still. It still causes the secretion of insulin rather. So a more reasonable carb intake of eating 20 to 50 grams per day and maybe like more like 25 to 50% protein would cause adequate insulin release where you wouldn't develop this issue. And the liver dysfunction happened because of the lipid overflow. So we're using a balance of saturated fats alongside different like monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats, like olive oil, fatty fish, and those good types of fats, like a hierarchy of different fats, rather than extreme fat loading would reduce the risk. And in the insulin secretion, that collapse happened because beta cells barely saw glucose or even protein for months. So fatty acids and ketones as that primary fuel source with nothing else. There was no glycemic challenge. There was no reason to produce insulin. So the system adapted by deprioritizing any kind of carbohydrate handling. And this was totally reversible. It wasn't permanent beta cell death. So if you're doing keto, here's what we need to change. Here's what we need to make sure we are doing to not run into these issues. First, make sure your keto diet is adequate in protein. Okay? This mouse diet was 10% protein, which is stupidly low. Okay? Humans should aim for, I would say, at least 30% protein on a ketogenic diet. Okay? To preserve your lean mass and support the metabolic function, at least 30%. And unless you are doing like a strict carnivore for a specific reason, I wouldn't go zero carb. Like 20 to 50 grams per day from some fibers and things like that. That's going to prevent that extreme lipid overflow just by slowing things down a little bit. So like even non-starchy vegetables. Okay, consider like some psyllium. Consider a little bit of like chia. Okay, it's good for your gut health and lipid metabolism anyway. And then third, the fat quality matters. There's a balance of saturated fats alongside monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats that is really good and much better than just extreme saturated fat loading. I'm all for saturated fat, but we do need to look at fats as a whole system. Okay, so think olive oil, avocados, nuts, fatty fish, along with butter and coconut oil. And then fourth, I've never been a fan of saying strict keto forever. Use it cyclically, even if it's a year and then a few months off. Okay? Years without a break, that can be stressful. It is stressful. So periodic carb refeeds with healthy fruit, healthy carbs, cycling between keto and low to moderate carb, or targeted carbs around training, all this will prevent that beta cell adaptation that you see in this like long-term ridiculous keto. You also need to monitor your response. So track your lipids, track your liver enzymes, track your fasting glucose, track how you feel. It's all good. Like if you see triglycerides climbing and you see your liver enzymes rising, where your glucose tolerance is worsening, these are signals that you need to maybe reintroduce carbs surrounding your workouts or something like that. The main point is that you need to use keto to restore metabolic flexibility, not replace it. We become a one-trick pony rather. This mouse study showed that impaired glucose tolerance happened because the animals lost their ability to handle carbs. Okay, but human studies generally show the opposite because we have improvements in insulin sensitivity, we have reduced reliance on medication, and in some cases, even full remission of type 2 diabetes. In fact, there was a study in nutrition and metabolism that compared a low-carb keto diet to a low glycemic index diet in grown-ups. You can tell I'm used to talking to kids with type 2 diabetes for 24 weeks. So the keto group in this case aimed for 20 grams of carbs per day with no calorie restriction, while the low glycemic index group followed 500 calorie deficit and low GI carbs. In this case, the keto group actually saw a 1.5% drop in their HbA1c, and there was only a 0.5% drop in the low GI group, and they lost 11.1 kilograms compared to 6.9 kilograms, almost double. And many of the participants in the keto group were able to either reduce or discontinue their diabetes medications. So keto works in humans when it's done right. The difference is the protocol. So 20 grams of carbs per day for 24 weeks is not the same as 0.1% carbs for years and years and years. Also in humans, not in mice. Okay, keto is a tool to improve the body's ability to switch fuels. I don't believe it should be this permanent metabolic state unless it's otherwise needed. So we use it strategically, we cycle it appropriately, and we monitor your response. So if you want to understand how to reintroduce carbs properly and do this right, I've done videos on this. I did a video on carb cycling strategies. It walks through exactly how to time carbs around training, around circadian rhythms, so you really can get kind of the best of both worlds. And I'll link to that video right here because I think it's a great next step. Fasting now versus then is crazy different. And it's all because we've had cutting edge science that has taught us new ways to do it, but also our own experience and trial and error. Imagine learning that you can make 1 or 2 little tweaks to your fasting strategy and it changes everything and makes it more effective. Sometimes you have to leave the ego at the door to embrace the changes that make something better. In today's video, we're going to cover the things that have changed in the last 5-6 years and how we look at fasting different and what that means for the practical changes now and how you can apply these changes right smack dab today. So before I jump right into it, I popped the link down below for 54% off Create creatine. They've been a partner of this channel for a very long time. They sweeten their creatine gummies with allulose, so it cancels out any of the carbohydrates, which makes it a tremendous tool for a tasty way to get that energy. Creatine is an energy building supplement. It is not a muscle building supplement. That extra energy lets you build muscle, lets you fight and combat potential inflammation. In my opinion, it allows you to feel like yourself again. It can even help with sleep deprivation based on some literature. So that link down below gets you 54% off the best creatine gummies that are on the market. Plus, I also put a link for their creatine stick packs if you want to go that route. Number one, so going down the list here, we used to think of fasting as predictable. That's how we looked at it. Fasting then was predictable and convenient. How can we fast every day in a way that simply allows us to restrict calories? So we do 16-8, we do things like that that allow us to just skip breakfast and just fast every day. But now, fasting looks different. We know that fasting in that way will slowly turn down your metabolism, will slowly affect your metabolic rate because you're fasting every day and you're skipping breakfast and you're missing out on the cortisol rhythms that would align with just simply eating 3 square meals every now and then. So by doing that, we were starting to see issues. So now we see fasting as a spike and a shock. We keep our baseline. We keep our healthy, nutritious 3 square meals, and occasionally we rip the carpet out from underneath it and shock the body. So the body has no choice but to go through a stressful period of its fast to adapt and create changes. Create changes that make us more metabolically flexible and healthier. So that looks like fasting 2 or 3 days per week, but perhaps a little more aggressively, and every other day just doing a simple 12-hour fast daily versus a 16-hour fast on the norm. Fasting then, we looked at it from an ancestral lens. Well, what did our ancestors do? Well, they would fast and then they would feast. And that's great if you're living like our ancestors. But I don't know a single person that's living outdoors 100% of the time. I do know some freaky geeks that do live out there for periods of time, but not all the time. We have climate control. We have cars. We're not our ancestors. And as much as it is cool to make pretend that we are living like cavemen, we have science and we have tools. A simple example is when we are fasting a lot and we need to shut down the cortisol spikes that are coming from fasting, the extra stress we're adding, guess what we can do? We can, at our beck and call, have a tablespoon of honey, blunt cortisol, because yes, honey and carbohydrates in short amounts, small amounts, will blunt cortisol and actually help us burn fat. We can turn that system off. So that's what I'll do. After a long fast, I will actually have a couple tablespoons of honey, or I'll have a little bit of potatoes, because it's at my beck and call. I am not an ancestor that had to fast until I got my food. I can fast and be in control and use tools, and I can break it and be in control and use tools. And I suggest you lean into that and embrace what we have available. We used to look at fasting purely as a stressor for fat loss. How do we use it for fat loss and for cell repair? And we focus on the taking away of food only. Now we view fasting as a signal that triggers the body to change, that triggers cellular and metabolic adaptations. It's not about the caloric restriction. Yes, you'll restrict calories. Yes, that has benefit. But what we're really looking at here is the effects after the fast that the fasting brought on. The upregulation of antioxidant systems in the body, the downregulation of inflammatory cytokines, the modulation of cortisol, the regulating of diurnal rhythms. Treat your fasting as a random shot in the arm, not as a form of caloric restriction, even though some nutritional zealots will tell you it's only calorie restriction. There are other benefits. And if you view it as just calorie restriction, you are limiting yourself and obsessing over calories, which in my opinion becomes a bigger problem for a disordered way of thinking if you're obsessing over calories. Eat healthy, eat nutritiously, don't focus on calories so much, and then occasionally just rip food away and go back to normal. Which brings me to the next one. We used to think of it as just a simple way of skipping breakfast and cutting out 1/3 of your calories. That is not wrong. That is absolutely 100% accurate. But the focus is now a little bit more on fine-tuning circadian cues, fine-tuning the nervous system, sympathetic state, parasympathetic state. If we focus just on calorie restriction, a lot of times people take it too far and they just restrict calories after they're done fasting too. And they obsess over it, and it becomes a highly sympathetic nervous system state. Why do you think that people can't stick on a diet? Why do you think that people have trouble? It comes with this over-fixation on calories, which no one is denying from a contained physics, not a true, like, open thermodynamic system. But in a closed thermodynamic system, calories do make sense, and yes, I get it, I'm not denying that. But the obsession with it is too far. Eat, nourish yourself, move, and then occasionally don't eat excessively. We used to think of it as the key to cellular repair. This is how we get autophagy, this is how we get stem cells. We fast. I think we kind of got over that obsession, and now the way that we look at it is we look at it as giving our body the tools to be able to repair that way. So how does that look for our fasting? It means if we know that a longer fast is going to trigger more autophagy and trigger this and that, then maybe we can occasionally do a long fast, but then we focus on the repair side. Fasting then focus on the fasting part doing the work, when in reality, the fasting part just starts the signal. The eating part is the repair. You don't build muscle in the gym, you build muscle when you eat and when you sleep. Just like fasting is what's breaking down the tissues and doing the thing, if you never rebuild, that wouldn't be very good, would it? So you have to rely on the repair. So adequate calories, adequate nutrition, adequate minerals, proper micronutrients. I suggest now we focus more on what we eat during our eating period and let fasting just be simple. In fact, I'm even guilty of that. I used to obsess over what to do during a fast and cared less about what was happening outside of a fast. That's a little bit of a disordered mindset if you think about it now from what we know. I would rather get all my nutrients and then occasionally trust that my body can do what it needs to do in a seriously calorie-deprived state. And if you think that way, I think you might find it liberates a brain. This is a big one. We used to think low insulin all the time. Crush insulin. It has its benefits. Now we view it different. Now we view it as refresh insulin signaling. Let's not just crush insulin to the floor and manually try to push it down all the time. Let's just keep insulin crushed, keep it down, keep it down, keep it down. No, let's crush insulin, and then let's let the body learn. Now that the insulin signal is a little more refreshed, let's teach our body how to use these signals properly so that it's not relying on me having to crush it down all the time, trying to have this illusion of control over my body. That's not how it works. We can occasionally fast, and we can train our body to refresh that insulin signaling so it can function with insulin in harmony, rather than trying to rip away a very important hormone. And that may sound like I am a big fan of carbohydrates. I'm not. I eat carbohydrates as a signal. I treat my carbs as a signal to make me more parasympathetic when I need to be calmer, because that's what carbohydrates can do. I don't need them for fuel. I need carbohydrates as a signal to tell my body quickly and abruptly, I'm safe, I have fuel, you can turn off the cortisol. So that leads me to something pragmatic that you can do. When you're fasting and you feel like you need to end your fast, just like I mentioned before, it's okay to have carbohydrates. All you need is 10, 20, 30 grams to shut off the cortisol spike, and then it's done. Then you go back to your normal diet. We used to use fasting for burning fat. That was how we looked at it. It was about fat oxidation, about zone 2, about training the cells and mitochondria to utilize fat for fuel. 100% so true. But now it's more about metabolic flexibility. How can we learn to use fats when it's time to use fats? And how can we learn to use carbs when it's time to use carbs? If we're using fats when we're fasting, well, we don't necessarily want to use fats all the time when we're not fasting. What about when we need to use some carbs? Does that just mean that our body's going to lose glucose tolerance? Well, to a certain degree, that can happen. And even when you look at some of the people that have gone back and forth between carnivore and not, that's one of the biggest things they've claimed. High cortisol when they're fasting too much. The inability to oxidize glucose very well when they were doing too much fasting. Those are the real things that teach us, okay, fasting works, but we need to use it as a tool and a signal to train our body to be metabolically flexible. So what does my fasting strategy look like now? And I talked about this in another video. I keep it simple. 7 days a week, I do a minimum 12-hour fast. Without fail, 7 to 7, that's going to be the way that it is. At least maybe 6 to 6, maybe 8 to 8, but usually 7 to 7. 12-hour minimum. Then 2 days per week, I do longer, like 20-hour fasts. 1 day a week, I'll skip breakfast, and then 1 day a week, I skip dinner. It's that simple. And if I really need to add a little extra punch, I'll add an extra day. My fast-breaking meal looks something like this now. It's more of like a half to 1 cup of mashed potatoes that is like just plain potatoes, no fats added to it, usually red potatoes, or occasionally rice, with a tablespoon or 2 tablespoons of honey, with about 8 ounces of chicken and bone broth mixed into the rice and honey, or the potatoes and honey. That is simple and very easy, and it makes it consistent to where I'm not afraid to have the carbs post-fast, but then after that, carbs aren't really in the equation that much, unless it's a little bit in the evening time. Now, if you want to see me do a video on more of what I eat in a day here in 2026, I'm happy to do that. Just put it down below in the comments section. But I also did a video right here that talks about theanine and how theanine is one of the more powerful cortisol-reducing compounds that's out there, and it's dirt cheap. So you want to check that video out on how to strategically use it. As always, cortisol plus insulin equals visceral fat. Stress equals cortisol. But what if there was something that you could do that would just pattern interrupt and stop that stress? Because if you were to dedicate your entire life toward being stress-free, you live in a monastery somewhere and you just forget about the rest of the world and be an emotional basket case otherwise. But if you could just do simple things that would stop that cortisol spike at night, then maybe you could stop the accumulation of the visceral belly fat. So in this video, I've got a simple thing that you can do. 200 milligrams of this stuff, we're seeing any evidence, can really cut cortisol. That's based upon salivary cortisol testing. So in this video, we'll cover that, but then I also have 2 other tips I'm going to give you. One is just a simple spice that you can use, and another one is a little bit more of a habit or a tool you can implement in the evening time. Something you may want to implement or be aware of too is that any kind of micronutrient deficiency can impact cortisol too. Think about it. If you're stressed out because you're not getting enough nutrition, your body goes into that sympathetic overdrive, fight or flight mode, because you're not getting adequate nutrition. So I do think something like a good multivitamin can be really good. So there's a company called 5 Health, which has really cool structured multivitamins that are in these individual sort of micro beads. So they break down at different points in time, and they don't have competing minerals or competing vitamins, right? So for example, we got magnesium, they cancel each other out. So that's why they have it broken up into like a daytime stack and an evening stack. And they actually break down in your system at different periods of time so that you're getting
ความรู้ความเข้าใจและสำหรับเมื่อคืนนี้ก็มีผู้มาสอบถามว่าที่พระอาจารย์ท่านบรรยายเกี่ยวกับเรื่องของวนรอบ3มีอาการ12กับที่ผมกล่าวไปมันมีข้อแตกต่างกันนิดหนึ่งข้อแตกต่างก็คือว่าผมไม่ได้เชื่อมโยงระหว่างสัจจญาณในที่อื่นแต่ท่านพระอาจารย์ก็เชื่อมโยงสัจจญาณในที่อื่นที่มีการกล่าวถึงสัจจญาณโดยอนุโภชญาณกับปฏิเวชญาณประมาณสงเคราะห์แต่ที่ผมเรียกว่าที่อาตมากล่าวก็คือพูดถึงวนรอบ3อาการ12ที่อยู่ในหมวดของการเจริญกรรมฐานที่ทำให้ได้บรรลุมรรคไม่ว่าจะในที่ใดก็แล้วแต่ก็จะมีการกล่าวในเรื่องของสัจจญาณกิจญาณกัตตญาณร่วมกันจะไม่มีการกล่าวกิจญาณแยกออกไปต่างหากกิจญาณสัจจญาณกิจญาณแล้วก็กัตตญาณพระท่านก็เลยถามว่าทำไมมันไม่เหมือนกันก็เลยบอกว่าท่านอาจารย์ในสงเคราะห์แต่ที่อาตมารู้ว่าที่ผมได้กล่าวไว้ก็คือกล่าวตามบริบทในสถานที่นั้นในการที่กล่าวถึงวนรอบ3มีอาการ12อันนี้ก็ให้เราถือเอาตามที่ปรากฏอย่างนี้ไปก่อนส่วนจะได้เหตุผลข้อมูลอะไรตรงไหนเพิ่มเติมว่ามีการสงเคราะห์ตรงไหนบ้างก็จะมาแจ้งให้ทราบในภายหลังส่วนท่านอาจารย์ท่านก็ดูหลายที่หลายแห่งซึ่งในหลายที่หลายแห่งนั้นมันไม่สามารถที่จะทำความเข้าใจได้ในช่วงระยะเวลาสั้นๆเพราะว่าตามที่ผมได้ดูมานะครับมันจะมีคำว่าสัจจญาณอยู่ในที่อื่นซึ่งจะไม่พูดถึงสัจจญาณในที่นั้นจะไม่พูดถึงกิจญาณไม่พูดถึงกัตตญาณจะพูดสัจจญาณว่ามี2อย่างสัจจญาณเป็นโลกิยะและก็โลกุตระในโลกิยะและโลกุตระนั้นใครมันโลกิยะก็มี2อย่างคืออนุโภชญาณและก็ปัจเจเวคขณญาณการที่กล่าวปัจเจเวคขณญาณแม้ไม่ได้กล่าวกัตตญาณก็จริงอยู่แต่ก็สามารถดูได้ด้วยศัพท์คำว่าปัจเจเวคขณญาณนั่นแหละในตรงนี้ท่านอาจารย์อาจจะเห็นแง่มุมตรงนี้ก็เลยส่งเคราะห์เข้าไปนะครับส่วนอนุโภชญาณแม้ไม่ได้กล่าวในที่นี้ก็จริงแต่มีอธิบายในมูลฎีกาที่บอกว่าทุกขญาณคืออะไรบ้างทุกขญาณก็คือสวนะ